I thought a lot about what I wanted to give to you, and I thought what would be most interesting is to give you the feeling of walking through the exhibits. So if you have the option of going to a bigger screen now, I would suggest that you do that because you'll have the experience of walking through the Tokyo Dome and walking through QuiltCon if you are on a larger screen. So I'll just blather on about a couple things here while you think about that. I'm going to go to my presentation. Here we go. Get to the first slide here. Good. I just think it's great that I can come here and share with all of you my experience of walking through and photographing the shows and have it help out the museum as well. So I'm just tickled that we can do both of those things at the same time. So thank you for inviting me. I do suggest that you take notes. There's a lot of information. This is going to be pretty dense, and you will see things. Everything is not just, I'm not going to be giving you words as much as images. So there will be things that will be inspiring that hopefully will take you through the next few months while we're all staying at home and hopefully getting through the end of this virus. I will give you this link again, but on flickr.com, if you want to go and check out my page, I have, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16,000 photos in several different albums, and you can look at images of quilts from many different shows or from around the world for back several years. So if you'd like to have a little eye candy, please take advantage of that. So for those of you who did sign up a month ago, I thank you for your patience. This is what was happening 30 minutes before our event was supposed to start, and it was pretty terrifying. The wind was blowing, and we had a fire like this several years ago, and it jumped the highway and raced across the plains and came within a mile of our warehouse. And I just, my mom's in a nursing home near there. I just knew that I wouldn't be able to think straight. So thank you, Laura, for being very gracious and allowing me to reschedule. I live next door to Celestial Seasonings Tea Factory. We went out to Celestial that night, and this is what we saw on the foothills. It was pretty scary. And I know that you guys have gone through the same thing. My family's from California, so I'm very aware and very connected to what has been happening to you as well. So hopefully we can move through all of this, and hopefully greater minds will prevail in terms of the climate change that is driving these fires. So let's all go to the Tokyo Quilt Festival. Gosh, it doesn't feel like, what is it, 10 months ago? It feels like a year ago at least that I was there. This is the view from my hotel room, looking down on the Tokyo Dome. If you haven't ever been there before, they have held the show in the baseball stadium, the Tokyo Dome, which is next to the Ferris wheel and the roller coaster. It's kind of a otherworldly place. And when you line up to go in, there can be 5,000 to 10,000 people on the first morning just waiting to get in. Usually there are about 35,000 people who come to the show every day. And what is it? 250,000, 120,000 people come to the show over a week. Maybe it's more than that. Anyway, it's a lot of people. So once you go inside, you're inside this covered baseball stadium, and this is what it looks like. You walk down the stairs, there are all these seats. It's not like Houston. They have plenty of seats for everybody. Seating is not an issue. But when everybody comes in, it's extremely crowded. But fortunately, because I've been going there for many years, I have a press pass. So I can go in before it opens up and take these kind of photos. So I'd like you to just sit back and relax and imagine that you're at the Tokyo Quilt Show here. And then we'll look at some of the individual quilts. This is where we should have the elevator music going, right, Laura? So the show is laid out. They have these rubber tiles, you'll see, and then they have painted walls. And I've never seen a show that's set up like this before. A temporary show. Usually we have pipe and drape in other quilt festivals. And if you've gone to Houston or any other gallery or show where we see Japanese quilts, there's a certain type of Japanese quilt that we're really used to seeing That's changing now because of machine quilting. We'll talk about that some more. But in the past, a lot of those quilts were pastel colors or indigo or taupe, right? That light brown, kind of grayish brown color. And in the last few years, there's been a lot of color in the quilts. What's interesting is that they have changed one of the top categories. There used to be something called a friendship award, and now they have a machine quilting award. Wow, that is huge. That is a huge change because, as you know, Japanese quilters are known for their hand quilting, right? So this pink and cream quilt on the left, you might have assumed that it was one of those amazing, you know, teeny tiny hand applique quilts, but no, this got the machine quilting award. The aisles are very wide and there's really a spacious feeling because of, well, it's in the Tokyo Dome. You know, it's the ceiling is so high above you, you don't even have a sense of space. It feels like you're outdoors. These are traditional quilts, but you can see if you think about the quilts we've seen in, like I say, Houston or elsewhere, where we've seen more of these symmetrical flowery type quilts, they're changing, aren't they? The wa category is for quilts that are considered very traditional Japanese, or they express some traditional Japanese thought, something that's very cultural. And again, these quilts have been changing quite a bit the last few years. This is also the wa category. We'll see some close-ups of these quilts later. Now, if you've never been to the Tokyo Dome show, many quilts are made from indigo fabrics, and what these are is they buy used kimonos and scraps of indigo fabric at flea markets, or maybe they have them in their stash of, you know, grandma's kimonos and yukatas, and they cut them up and make these beautiful indigo quilts. The quilt in the middle here is made from cut up silk kimonos. So the colors that are being used in Japanese quilts is really changing radically over the last, I would say, 3 years. And on the left here, the original design category, this is something I've never seen before, a quilt with using African fabrics, imported West African fabrics, those big, bold prints. So I hope you're kind of getting a sense of the space here, what it's like to walk through. And then just imagine 35,000 people. So the trick is to go early or to come and stay late, because about 4 o'clock, all the ladies start leaving to get on the train and go home to make dinner for their husbands. And I'm not making that up. That's what I was told by my friend who's my translator when I'm there. This quilt on the right is an abstract piece depiction of planet Earth. And these kinds of themes, again, I've been seeing more and more in shows as I travel around the world. You know, I go to the Birmingham show, which of course did not occur in person this year. I go to Canada about every other year. I go to Mexico, and then other shows. I've gone to New Zealand a few times. And these themes about, well, really about climate change and the environment and endangered species, for instance, but also lately about human rights and even social justice have been coming up more and more. This piece on the right with the chrysanthemums are a very typical Asian theme, right? We see that in Japanese fabrics, but the way that it was rendered is very unique, and I'll show you a close-up of this quilt a little later. So what I really love is to go to quilt shows around the world and see how that local culture is expressed and how it's sort of migrating or combining with influences, with art and design influences and trends from other quilt shows and from other countries and other parts of the world. So this blue and black and white quilt in the original design category, this is something that would have been, I think, unheard of several years ago in Japan. Something that is so different from the traditional Japanese symmetrical, pretty quilts. Well, here's one of those symmetrical pretty quilts. It is a very beautiful handmade quilt in the traditional category. You may notice the lady on the left here, she's wearing her kimono and her obi, but you'll see that she has a face mask on. So I went to this show with my daughter. Many of you know my daughter, Sophie, who we adopted from China. Happened to adopt her during the SARS epidemic in 2003. Well, she came with me to this exhibit, and just as we were leaving, it was just starting to get serious in Japan, and people were really starting to freak out. So we started to wear our mask when we went to the show and went out on the street and so on. But in Asia, it's very normal to wear a mask. It's just part of life. It's been that way for decades. So when you're in the show, when everybody else is in there, it's not unusual for like 10 or 12 people to be clustered around one of the fabulous quilts taking these kinds of photos. They get very, very close and they take photos with their phones, just like this. They never touch the quilt. They're very respectful. And so they don't have to cordon them off. They just allow you to walk right up to the quilt because everybody knows you don't touch the quilt. Here in the States, often I'm surprised at how many people their first impulse is to just walk up and touch the quilt, and we have to put signs up to tell them not to do that. But this group of fans and friends of the Tokyo Quilt Festival, they all know how to behave at a quilt show, which is lovely. And there you get kind of a sense of the space. Here's another angle of that traditional category of the first, second, and third winners. And considering that it's traditional, this is really quite a change as opposed to those symmetrical, flowery medallion type quilts, right? So if you don't know who Keiko Goke is, she's been a designer for Free Spirit Fabrics here in the US for several years now. I was fortunate to meet her and become friends with her about 10 years ago. And when we delivered 2,500 comfort quilts to those who had lost their homes in the tsunami and earthquake several years ago, she lives in Sendai. She didn't live on the coast, so she didn't lose her home. But when she found out that we were doing this, she went out of her way to connect with me and introduce me to the organizer of the show, which is actually really difficult to meet the organizer of the show. So you can see that she is extremely colorful. She had her own exhibit. So I want to show you some of her quilts. So if you run across her fabrics, you can think about the quilts that she makes. They're very joyful. Not too many symmetrical quilts. A lot of them are really gestural, I would say. But the center of the exhibit was this gigantic patchwork ball. And then see all the little balls underneath it? So on the left is the giant ball. You can see the little people down underneath. And then the little balls that were piled up, those were like beach ball size. And on the right side here is a close-up of the smaller balls. So how did she do it? I had dinner with her and she explained to us, she got a gigantic weather balloon, she blew it up, she covered it with essentially paper mache, and then started piecing and fitting that and hand stitching it onto the giant ball. Isn't that incredible? How do you come up with something like that? She is really a creative genius. But her work is just so happy. And it's a combination of machine stitching with hand stitched details. You can see on the left here, the squiggles. And the piece on the right is a great example of what I would call a gestural movement. You know, if you imagine moving your hand across a drawing paper and making a gestural mark on a piece of paper, and to be able to transfer that to a quilt is really quite a trick, but it's very effective, right? Because our eyes are naturally drawn to these gestural kinds of movements and shapes. I love the cactus piece on the left. And I will say that long before we started using plaids here in the US, they were using yarn-dyed plaids in their quilts in Japan, and I just love that. So that's a trend that, from my perspective, traveled across the ocean, and then we did our own version of it. And I think American quilters are still thinking about different ways to use yarn dyes in their work. Here are some more traditional Asian quilts. And you can see there's a white glove lady who's talking about the sphere on the right. I notice you'll see that there are a lot of quilts here that have a sphere in them. So perhaps that tendency towards medallions and symmetrical quilts has transferred itself onto the many spheres that we see in the quilts now. You'll recall that blue and white planet Earth quilt that I pointed out to you several screens ago. So here are a couple close-ups. Now, I want to tell you something about giving credit to these Japanese artists. I have been asking them for many, many years to please get the artists to translate their names into Romaji, to spell out their names. So the Western quilters who come to visit, when they photograph the artist's statement, they can at least give credit to the artist. But what do you do when the artist's name is not listed in something that we can read? So what I do is I take a photo of the card, and then in Photoshop, I paste the name onto the image. So however that image is shared, the artist's name will always be with it. There are more and more tour groups that have been coming to the Tokyo Quilt Festival over the years, and I see people just snapping pictures like crazy and just posting them. And unfortunately, the artists don't get credit that way. But I think that they are committed, once they reopen again, to really encouraging these artists to spell out their name. The way it was explained to me is that a lot of these ladies are older and they just don't really know how they would spell their name in Romaji, how they would spell it out for us to go on an artist card. So the one on the left is the silk kimono quilt. So this artist collected many silk kimonos and then cut it up to make this piece. Pretty amazing piece. And then the one on the right, this is the chrysanthemum that I was talking about. And just as an example of how we see trends, design trends that migrate, a few years ago, you may have noticed that there was a design trend of making things look like it was kind of a smudged blackboard or chalkboard. And that's what this reminds me of, the background, like somebody drew the butterflies in white on a chalkboard, and then the flowers are superimposed in full color in front. One of the categories of quilts there are miniature quilts, and at this show, they're all framed. So for instance, in Houston and Birmingham, they'll just have a miniature quilt hanging itself on the wall. But at this show, there is a frame. These are about 14 or 15 inches wide. So this shows two different types of miniature quilts. The teeny tiny piece quilt on the left, and then the stitch quilt on the right. Sorry, still coughing from the fires we've had here. This, I believe, is a student of the teacher who does mola quilts. So mola quilts come from Central America. but that technique has been picked up by Japanese quilters, and there is one teacher who teaches this technique, and so you see many different mola style quilts now when you go to Tokyo. This is a more traditional quilt, but it was not a medallion. It's not symmetrical. It's an overflowing basket of flowers, which is quite lovely. This is all done by hand. Here's a close-up of the Planet Earth quilt that I showed you before. See what time it is. Keep track of my time here. And I'm going to show you several close-ups of these quilts, just so you can see the combination of machine and hand stitching. And Japanese just love matryoshka dolls. And there are quite a few Russians who come to the show over the last many years, I have noticed. So there's some cross-pollination that occurs there as well. Now take a close look at this quilt. This is where having a big screen comes in handy. So the first thing perhaps your eye is drawn to is all those little button type round appliques. And then we start looking at the stitching in the background, but go even further and look at the echo quilting in the background, in the white background, and how that negative space has been filled. Filling up white negative space is something that I have seen coming over from modern quilters into Japanese quilting. You know, originally Japanese quilters inspired the modern quilters, and now the modern quilters are inspiring the Japanese quilters. It's very busy, but it's a very exciting piece. Just all these little fishies all swimming upstream. And then here's another more traditional version of fish. And of course, fish is one Japanese, very typical Japanese theme. This one using more of that traditional indigo and white color story. But think about the mixture of techniques that we're seeing here. And when I think about 20 years ago and how far we've come, how far all of us have come all around the world, it used to be that, oh no, you can't mix techniques, you can't mix fabrics, you can't have raw edges. Isn't it wonderful that we don't have to be bound by those rules anymore? Not that we ever were, right? Just an incredible, beautiful, and very intricately pieced quilt. And here's a close-up of some of that hand stitching. So there's also been kind of an overlap between sashiko stitching and kantha stitching from India, and how that's made its way into art quilting, and the slow stitching movement too. This one really pops. I like all those little curly cues that explode out of the center egg. Another theme that the Japanese really adore is anything that's Hawaiian. Here's a bird of paradise. Has kind of a stained glass look, but you'll see that the black stained glass effect turns into red on the bottom, which makes it even more interesting. Here's a giant snowflake with a lot of hand stitching. See all those tiny little nubs of stitches? And here is a very peaceful scene of a lake and a village in Europe with swans in the foreground. This one made me kind of dizzy, but it's very creative. Even though it's symmetrical, there's this feeling that the design has been pushed in one place and pulled in another. Again, we see the spheres. So this is a new, more modern or contemporary kind of medallion. But look at all the little scribbles, the real gestural hand-stitched that floats over the top. And think about what does it take to make a gesture like that that looks like a little kid scribbled on top of it, and yet we know that it took a long time for the quilter to carefully stitch every little stitch on that line that looks so wild and free. What a bold piece. We've got the contrast of the warm and the cool, and then we have the contrast of the background, the dark and the light. So the things that draw our eye to a quilt often are contrasts, right? Complementary colors, warm versus cool, dark versus light, and this is a really effective use of all of those eye-catching techniques. And here is a lovely hand-stitched traditional medallion quilt. So a lot of times when I go to these shows over the years, there will be several quilts that look the same, and I would ask my translator, why is that? And she said, because they all study with the same teacher, and they have to make a quilt like this to study with this teacher. So there's kind of a push-pull going on. There's a very long, respected tradition of master teachers, and in order to come up through the ranks, so to speak, in Japan, you have to study with one of these teachers and become certified and so on. Many people have asked me over the years, well, how do I get to teach at Tokyo Quilt Festival? And I said, well, unless you're one of these certified teachers, you don't. But I know that there are many people who are trying to change that. It's just a very rather rigid structure that they have in place for many years. But as those teachers age and retire, and younger quilters come in with a lot of creative energy, I do expect that things will change. This is a lot of fun. This is obviously a music theme. See the notes and the pianos, cute little daisies. Can't look at Japanese quilts without looking at cute quilts, somewhere in there. Now this is taking a traditional block, blowing it up, and then filling each block with other blocks. See the houses that are fit in there? And this is a quilt that uses the traditional, perhaps recycled indigo fabrics, and then piecing in these fire red and gold colors to create fireworks. Here's a close-up on some beautiful stitching on top of some of those recycled indigo fabrics. Now this is a huge quilt. These bunnies are about at least 3 feet tall. And notice the use of gradient. So I assume that she hand painted the fabrics and then cut them up and used them in this piece. But look at how this piece, the bunnies seem to be floating, and there's a real sense of three-dimensionality. And that's because of the gradient fabrics that have been used. And we see this also being used a lot in modern quilts. Now here is perhaps the last remnant of that taupe color trend, which has been running for at least 10, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 years. Seems like from the very first time that I went to Tokyo, I saw indigo and taupe. But this is a really beautiful, intricately pieced quilt. And this quilt shows an African, I believe it's a baobab tree, and you can see that the quilter has used, again, those large-scale West African imported fabrics, and that's something that's very new and different at the Tokyo show. And this artist always does one cat quilt that is in Tokyo. And here it is. And they're always black and white cats, appliqued, hand-stitched embroidery outline, and here she's added in some flowers. So the bad news is the Tokyo Quilt Festival has been canceled for January 2021. And who knows, if and when it will come back. I mean, the Japanese are extremely careful about any kind of pandemic. And I also wonder whether it will return to the Tokyo Dome. It may be completely reinvented. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens there. So let's go to QuiltCon now. So QuiltCon was in February, 1 month later in Austin, Texas. And just thought this was kind of fun to show one of the quilts on the left and a mural outside the restaurant across the street from the convention center. And we see a reflection of those same kind of colors. So this show is so different from any other show I've ever been to. I've gone to every QuiltCon show since the first one. It is set up, they don't try to put down carpet or rubber tiles. They put up kind of light gray pipe and drape. And so when you make a quilt that you think you want to go to Houston and QuiltCon, you have to think about that Houston hangs on a black pipe and drape, but QuiltCon hangs on a light gray. And you'll see as we go through what that means. But again, I just want you to have a kind of a feeling of walking through this show and experiencing the quilts and the space and the colors and the design aesthetic. So 10 years ago, when the Modern Quilt Guild was getting off the ground and it was all being organized online, they wanted to operate from a new kind of design aesthetic that was more simple and clean. They were almost in reaction to really collaged, fussy, over-embellished quilts that were happening in the contemporary quilt world at that time. And I would say that the Modern Quilt Guild has really expanded and progressed and mutated beyond anybody's expectations. So the first several slides here are just showing you what it's like to walk through. And imagine these quilts hanging on a black background. So for instance, for this quilt on the right, it kind of blends into that background, right? Because it's white. So you would see more of the colored blocks that are contained within the white negative space. If that quilt was hanging in another show with the black background, the whole quilt would pop off the background. So this is something I think a lot of quilters don't think about when they're designing quilts and hoping that it will be in several different shows. And the one thing that you'll notice right away is the colors that are used are so different. And that's part of what really intrigues me about the modern quilt movement, is that the colors are just so unique and really very forward. So many years ago in the color marketing group, which is a color forecasting group that I belong to, we were talking about, do you remember when Mad Men was on the cover of Vogue in the September issue? And we talked about how mid-century modern was a design concept that was going to influence all of our different industries. So I was with people who were, making paint and wallpaper and carpet and cars and electronics and so on, and furniture and lamps. And we all thought about, well, how will that influence our industry? And this was a couple years before the Modern Quilt Guild started, I believe. And then a couple years later, when those modern quilts started popping up with those kinds of colors, I thought, oh, that's it. That's how that design influence is going to express itself. This year, there was an exhibit by Victoria Victoria Findlay Wolf. And her quilts are so big and bold and eye-catching. It was a great venue for her work. Victoria was the winner of Best of Show, the very first QuiltCon. And so it's been fantastic to watch her growth as an artist and a quilter. And here are some other quilts. And again, just take a look at the colors. And here you can see what I mean about how these light or gray quilts kind of blend in with the background at this particular show. So initially, modern quilters often would take traditional blocks and they would resize or recolor them. And there was a lot of work with solid. And some people thought that you couldn't make a modern quilt that had applique or batiks. And of course, when you inject creativity into a new design movement, all those rules, supposed rules, are going to get blasted apart. And it turns out they were never rules to begin with. Here we still see the solid. I mean, the solid fabrics are still a very big trend. A lot of people make quilts out of solids, and they make use of negative space and a lot of dense quilting, a lot of ruler work. And there's so many long arm quilters and of course machine quilting, but I would say many more long arm quilters in the modern quilting movement than there are in the art quilt or contemporary quilt movement. There are a lot of words that are being put into quilts as well. And there's a lot of collaboration, group quilts, people coming together, which I think is, personally, I think if quilters ruled the world, we could solve all of the world's problems, because when you see the group quilts that people make and the people who come together with different ideas and how they come up with the finished piece, it's kind of a small miracle. These are all group quilts. And here you can see some of that social justice, human rights that are being expressed in this particular quilt. And I believe the black quilt in the background here is the one that won the best group quilt, but this whole aisle here is group quilts. Now, it used to be with group quilts, everybody would take a strip of the quilt or a block of the quilt, and they would all do a piece of an overall idea, but these seem to be much more spontaneous. Like there's a general theme, maybe a color theme, and they all do their thing and then they fit them together. We have a lot of black and white quilts coming up in just a moment. This was in the general exhibit, but there's a whole category of black and white quilts coming up. And again, just make note of the colors. There may be a particular color combination here that really piques your interest or your creativity. Even this, which is a red, white, and blue, which you might think is a very traditional color combination, actually it's a very cool kind of violet blue with a dark, intense red. So all of the modern quilt guilds all around the country and the world make a charity quilt that comes to be exhibited, and then it is, I don't know all the details about the charity part, but I believe it is donated or it is raffled off to raise money for a local charity when the quilt comes back to them. And this year they were black and white quilts with words. And boy, did they have a lot to say. It was like, you know, there was a lot of built up emotion that got poured into these quilts in this exhibit. And it was very powerful. As I walked through, I would see people standing in front of quilts weeping or laughing. I think the days where we told people, you know, don't put words in your quilt, don't make something that could be possibly construed as political. There are so many issues that have been politicized. It's almost like there's nothing left that hasn't been politicized. And so we have to really decide what we want to say in our quilts based on morality. Sometimes there are environmental issues or human rights issues that are moral issues, are ethical issues, not political issues. And so this exhibit really was a place for not just individuals, but these groups, these quilt guilds, to express their feelings. And there are a lot of them. And I like that it wasn't just black and white quilts, but it was shades of gray too. You know, we've been living in a world where things have been so polarized and things tend to be in black and white, but the reality is the world that we live in is full of shades of gray. That's where most of us live. That's the space that most of us want to occupy, is the place in the middle, not the extreme. And again, I believe that what's coming up with quilt making and artists is that we're going to find ways to bring ourselves back together again, to heal, to invite others to step into that middle space where we can connect again. So there were some angry messages, but there are also some incredibly powerful, positive, inspiring words and phrases that were in this exhibit. And they did come from all over the world, all over the country, but also all over the world. And there were topics that were expressed here that in the past would have been considered taboo. But I think after we've gone through, for instance, the Me Too and other similar movements illuminating issues, those issues are being expressed here in these quilts. So I want to show you just a few of the quilts up close and in detail. Julie Smith's quilts are really spoke to me. They're very powerful. They're very graphic, but you'll see that the white space is not empty by any means. And in this case, you know, these two quilts are full of very dense stitching, which is presumably done with ruler work on a long arm. Very precise, parallel, dense stitching. And this is another piece by her. You may have noticed it in a previous slide. Gosh, I see so much purple and orange. There was a time in the past where we never would have dreamt of using those colors together or even having them be, the main color story. Remember the old days when people would say, oh, I could never use yellow, and they think of it in terms of a color that they would wear. Well, yellow is actually a very powerful color as a complementary color to purple, to highlight, to be an accent color. And then now we have a color trend of this yellow-green, which you can see that's worked into the detail on the right-hand side. This is a British quilter, and Nick actually showed this quilt a year ago in Birmingham, and I got to see it up close. And he now, I believe he has a book out, and he was traveling and teaching, but he's one of these young quilters who is making a mark. This is a very large quilt, by the way. So when you stand in front of it, it really makes an impact. And again, think about contrast. We have a lot going on here. We have complementary colors, we have value contrasts, but we also have a lot of differentiation between the values or the complementary colors. So many different shades and tints of purple, for instance. Now, all of these are on my photo page. So I just want to remind you, don't worry that you have to capture all of these or remember them. All of these images are on my Flickr page. A solid quilt, but look at how the stitching follows the shape inside the solid block of color. This is another color trend, a lot of analogous colors that are bright and hot. So here we have not only the orange and the red, but the hot pink, the plum, the wine, the yellow. Here's a gigantic thumbprint. I think this was with tiny bias strips. I just thought this was brilliant. So there's again, the gestural movement of the thumbprint on the background of these dense, very structured parallel stitching. And this is hand stitched. This really reminds me of the 70s. You get old enough, you have to just start laughing when you see these color and design trends bumping back into quilts that younger people are making. Now, this is not the artist, but I had to laugh. I walked up to photograph this quilt and I saw this woman standing here and I said, you know, if you hold still, you're just going to disappear into the quilt. Her bag and her dress exactly matched the quilt. And she looked at it, she went, oh yeah. So she allowed me to take her photo. I just love this pop art heart. Here are two different black and white quilts, very different, and yet they both make a real similar and very balanced graphic statement. They balance the black and white in completely different ways, but they kind of achieve the same result. And this is definitely a message. Comfort quilt for a lockdown drill. And this was a tied quilt. So this was not quilted, it was just, you know, tied with, I think, red yarn or thick red embroidery floss. And here's one of those Me Too quilts. Check out the stitching in the background. Now, another trend which has bounced back over here from Japan is using reclaimed or recycled materials. And this quilt was made entirely from the waistbands of denim jeans. I really love the flow of analogous color from the light value to the dark on the bottom. You really have a sense of movement and depth because of that. Here are two different versions of a rainbow ribbon. So it's interesting after you go through a whole show and you think about how these trends show up in different ways, right? So there have been a lot of protests with rainbow flags, and here we see that expressed in two very different ways. This is so simple, but so profound. You can just imagine the sun coming up on the cliffs of Sedona. Another one with really simple but beautiful color story, a very subtle, almost delicate color story. This was an Australian quilter, so you can see the influence in her color choice, right? A group quilt, you know, you could say, oh, that's a red and white quilt, but wow. And think about how each one of these people made their spontaneous section of the quilt and how it all came together. Well, I just wanted to show you a picture of a classroom at QuiltCon to remind you that we will all be together again soon, and hopefully we can get together and sew, whether it's at quilt retreats or classes. We have a classroom here. We had to cancel Paula Nadelstern and Susan Carlson, which was really very, very hard. But we know that we'll see you again. We'll see you in Houston. We'll see you at various quilt festivals around the world. I do want to show you the best of show. Now, every once in a while, we have a quilter who seems to spring from the head of the quilting gods fully formed. And the best of show at QuiltCon this year also won the Best Machine Quilting Award, which eQuilter sponsored. So Peter Byrne had just started quilting a few years, I think it's a couple years before he won this. He won the best of show and he won the best machine quilting. And a few years ago, there was somebody like this at Quilt Canada who won the best of show and the best first time entrant, both in the first time that she entered. So where do these people come from? Well, they both came from Canada. I don't know what they have in the water up there, but this was the best of show. And this is Peter. And this was the best machine quilted prize, which, as I said, was sponsored by eQuilter. And there's Peter. That's the name of the quilt. So you never know when these new quilters and these new talents are going to pop out of nowhere, which is, I think, is really exciting. I want to quickly show you some of the Social Justice Sewing Academy quilts. These are all made by young people. And Sarah Trail is the young genius mastermind behind this project. They start the kids off in workshops where they basically make quilts like this, and then they have adults who finish them off for them. They design them, they put their message into the quilt. And then many of them, at least for the younger quilters, are finished by adult volunteers. And you're going to see them covered in quilt magazines and at shows and so on more and more, because this is the next generation of quilters who are coming up, and this is what they have to say. Now, these were group quilts. This is the youth group, which we also sponsored. And I just want to show you a few of them up close, some of the messages that these kids put into their quilts. I really love seeing youth quilts in shows. There is a very strong youth quilt presence at QuiltCon in Tokyo and also in Birmingham. And I would love to see more of that in Houston and at other shows here in the US, because that's our future. We have to invite these young people in and allow them to say and create what they want to say and create. So again, all of these images are on my Flickr page, so don't worry, you can go back and study these and check out all the messages that the young people put in their quilts on my Flickr page. So I just want to say a few things about trends of 2020. You know, we joke about 2020 like, yeah, what else could happen next, right? Well, it's 2020. Well, guess what? 2020 is almost over. I don't think we're finished with some of these challenges. But think about the colors and the images that we've seen this year. How is that going to affect our art? You know, there's a huge army of sewing volunteers who've made millions of face masks when we didn't have the PPE that was needed at the beginning of the pandemic. We're having a spike again now, and that those face masks may be needed again. It's also been a year of incredible wildfires. And of course, those of you in California who are watching this, you know all too well what I'm talking about. When we look at Colorado, you know, the fires we've had are tiny compared to what the West Coast has had to endure. But then we see images like this on the news. And when I look at these images, I think about quilts, I think about color, I think about art and design. How does a year of looking at these kind of images affect our quilt making, affect our art? And you can see it in this quilt on the left side. This is in Deeds, Not Words. This is by Laura Wazalowski. Powerful colors there. And it also reminds me of, I love this image on the right. One of my favorite places to go when I go to DC, I go there regularly for several reasons. I love to go to the National Portrait Gallery. And this portrait of 4 female justices is one of my favorite pieces. I always go and visit the ladies. And here's a beautiful picture of a little girl who's contemplating, maybe she'll be one of our future justices. And there are pictures like this. This was John Lewis in bed, you know, at the end of his life with his quilts to comfort him. And RBG's lace collar, you know, we see that design motif coming out in so many different ways. Sometimes we're surprised when we realize that that's what we're looking at. Oh, she's got the RBG collar on her. That's been integrated into a work of art. It's like a secret little message. I also wanted to point out to you that if you ever see Senator Mazie Hirono from Hawaii, she often will speak to, if she's on CNN or one of these news stations being interviewed, she has a collection of art quilts behind her. And I also really invite you to look for collaborative art and street art, because there's so much, like the next trends, color and theme and design trends are bubbling up from street art right now. And in social media, I actually subscribe to all different street art channels and so on, because I want to watch, I want to follow what's going on. And I think that these same themes are going to be bubbling up in our quilt making in the next couple years, because there are a lot of heroes who have helped us to get through the challenges of this year. But also some of the portraits are just incredible in these street art. I mean, this is just art that people make for the sake of making something beautiful on a wall in an alley somewhere. And then we see that being expressed by artists like Biza Butler. A few weeks ago, there was an article about her in the New York Times, and I believe her exhibit is still at the Claire Oliver Gallery, but if you look her up, you can easily see her work. She was on the cover of Fiber Art Now, maybe a year and a half ago. And here's a mural artist right here in Boulder, where I live, who's making that same type of polychromatic portraits, but on a very large scale. So that is a trend. And of course, when a group of artists come together to make a huge mural like this on the side of a building, it's to inspire the whole community. And this is how we're going to come together again. We're going to collaborate and love each other's art and support each other. And there's no need to talk about the things that divide us. There's so many other things that bring us together. So these are the trends for you to watch in quilt making in 21 and 22. Activist quilts, mixed techniques, recycled and repurposed, group quilts, which are collaborative projects, words, and letters. Natural dyed fabrics, i.e. non-toxic. Memorial quilts, not just for COVID. And also meditation and healing images, because mental health is going to be an extremely important topic going forward, right? So I want to give you just a quick preview of the beautiful exhibit at Visions. Hopefully you can someday go to see them in person, but right now you can follow that link and see these images online. And you can see all of these trends, or most of these trends that I've talked about, being expressed in these quilts. So here are the trends that I found in Quilt Visions that you can look for when you visit or when you look at it online. I'm not going to go through them one at a time, but there will be a recording of the exhibit, and you can go back and study this and pause it and copy it if you wish. But my hope is that I have filled you up with creative juice so you can get back to your work. I just wanted to show you a couple of my quilts. The quilt on the right premiered at the Water is Life exhibit several years ago at the United Nations in Geneva. And the quilt on the left is in the Endangered Species exhibit, which is traveling now. And I put messages and words in my quilt because I have very strong feelings about the toxic contaminants that are causing genetic mutation in wildlife and humans. And I also wanted to share this with you. It would have been in the Washington, D.C. exhibit, which of course was canceled in Houston. But this is my hope that the White House will continue to endure as a symbol of hope, the people's house, and what it represents for our democracy. So that is the end of my presentation, but I think we're going to move on to questions here. You can visit these links, and of course you can just subscribe to the eQuilter newsletter if you'd like to follow me. I want to point out that 2% of all sales at eQuilter go to charity, and we've raised 1.7 million so far. And we're the only major retailer who is a major sponsor of many different galleries and museums and quilt festivals around the world. So we appreciate you supporting us so we can support you back. And that is the end of my presentation. Let the questions begin.